Okay, go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Greg. I'll call the meeting to order, and we'll recognize John. And I do apologize, John. Thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Here.
All right, I think, John, you're on.
Oh, really? Okay, fantastic. Hi, everybody. I'm John Kraska. I'm the executive director of an organization called Every Library. We are a political action committee for libraries, and we work with library communities when they're library leadership teams and communities when they're thinking about going to the ballot, or when there's a negotiation that can happen between a city council, county government, and the library team. We also do a fair amount of work on school library issues. Unfortunately, a lot of them are the save the school librarian situation, given the budget the budgets for a lot of school districts. We work on our political side, and then we also have a nonprofit side, our traditional 501c3 nonprofit. It's a public policy, tax policy, education policy think tank called the Every Library Institute, where we do a lot of research and a lot of training, and the work of understanding a little bit more about how voters think, how politicians think, how libraries are interrelated with the rest of government and society. On our political side, though, our 501c4, our political action committee, all the work that we do is pro bono and for free for the library community and for the library leadership team. I want you to hear that from the beginning when we're talking about best practices, as it were, for informational communications campaigns or other sorts of outreach. We really like to focus on what's happening in the community, your community. We've worked in places as big as New Orleans and Dallas and Miami. We've worked in places as small as Darby, Montana, where there's a couple of hundred people live. And the questions are always the same about where's my money going to go and who's going to spend my money. And that's the big work of a board. I've been on the board for my local library here in suburban Chicago, Berwyn, Illinois. I was in your seats for about 8 years. I was board president for 6 years. We never had to vote a millage or a levy or a bond when I was on that library board myself, but I had the great pleasure of doing the hiring of 2 directors and a construction project that just never, ever went smoothly. The one thing about boards that I always try and help support is that, how do I want to put this? I don't want to see you folks in your responsibilities to your neighbors and to the taxpayers move away from the image of the board and into the image of the tax man. A lot of times things get broken down if all we're doing is talking about dollars and cents and not the potential outcomes from a project or from a millage or from a voter engagement time. I want to make sure that I'm here today to not only share with you some of the hazards that take place, and the purpose of this conversation was around, why. There's 9 different titles for this, but there's 8 reasons that libraries potentially lose when they go to the ballot. One of the titles is, potentially stumbling on the path to the ballot. Another is getting out of our own way. Another is how are people wired to think and listen when we talk about taxes. So I want to spend a few minutes today taking you through some of the high level reasons that disconnects happen. It's not about your ideas. It's about 115 libraries that we've helped take to the ballot before. In places like Darby, Montana, where a couple hundred people live, in Potomac, Illinois, where 646 people live, where the entire thing on the ballot was a $38,000 increase to their tax base. The difference between having a children's librarian and not having one. And the same thing about there has happened in New Orleans, has happened in Dallas, has happened in Miami. Who are we? Who do we want to be? How do we want to take care of each other? How do we want to be working together to fund the common good? So if it's all good with you, let me take a pause before I get into it. Let me configure the screen here and everything so you can see the presentation. I'll take you through those kinds of high level things and then open it up for questions. But before I get into that, again, Every Library, Political Action Committee, pro bono, anything at the beginning that we need to chat about? Oh, donor supported. How are you pro bono, John? That's a great question. Thanks. We're donor supported as an organization. We have individual donors and corporate donors. Largely, when I say corporate, it's the library vendors. So when you do payables every month, you see, EBSCO, DEMCO, Gale, Follett, those kinds of companies, they are part of the library ecosystem. They understand that what we're doing to support good conversations with voters directly relates to the bottom line. And then our individual donors, they're from all walks of life. We've got people who are inside the library community. We've got folks who just believe in what we're up to. And that's really edifying to be able to do it like that. Cool. All right. Let me share my screen and do one of the most awkward things in the world in the COVID era, which is to let you see my desktop for a minute. It's like I'm in a changing room. Oh, wrong button. See, this is not right. It's like the first time I've ever done it, Beth. I apologize. Okay. And now the awkward question of, can you see my screen? Just give me a nod or two. Is it coming through? Okay, great. So there really are 8 reasons that libraries, well, lose. But why losing here is not necessarily the only thing I'm concerned about. It's there's a failure to communicate. There's a failure to necessarily listen sometimes. And I want to be able to talk through about what those breakdowns look like before you folks move too much further down the path to the ballot. The questions that are coming from voters that are different than opposition to a library measure is where I want to start from. There are a number of questions that we hear as library leaders. Maybe, it's at the grocery store, maybe it's, at a cocktail party, maybe it's even from across the dinner table. These questions around, why do we need libraries anyways? Do people still use libraries? What do the staff do there all day? Like, there are legitimate questions that people have out in the community. These are not oppositional moments. There are legitimate questions that you, as the library insiders, can answer that might feel a little hostile. I mean, if you're going to get a question like, what do you folks do there all day? That can feel, but it's appreciative inquiry in some ways. Maybe it's awkward, but it's not a source of opposition. Why do we need libraries is actually a very open-ended, especially if you're going to be talking about taxes. Why do we need libraries when everything is on the internet? They want an answer from somebody who's an expert. And part of the work that you have to do as you're preparing for any kind of ballot measure as a board, and as staff too, is to get yourselves very, very current with what your answers are here. The answer is not just to the details of your plan, but some of the basics, because when you put something on the ballot, people who have been otherwise driving by, seeing the parking lot's a little full and the lights are on, they think everything's fine, start paying attention in a different way. People who are not users of the library, who they're not going to become users anytime soon. They haven't been a user since they were kids, are going to be like, wait a minute, what's going on over there? And just asking the question is not a source of opposition. I want to take you through what those places are, though, in order to help inoculate you against future problems, potentially, and to differentiate between what is really a good dialogue. Do people still use the library in Auburn Hills, Michigan? That's not a hostile situation. What's unfortunate, though, so the places of real opposition, okay? This is agnostic. This comes, again, from working with hundreds of libraries around the country in all different kinds of demographics, in all different states of being, whether they're very successful and they're going to the ballot to extend their success, or there's certain kinds of failures that are happening for them, and they're going to the ballot to find the right kind of money to fix that failure, whether it's operationally or with a building. There are 8 big reasons, though, where the disconnect happens, and where it's not just questions and inquiry, it's a problem. I'm going to take you through all 8 in some details, but fundamentally they're grouped into communications, ideology, and in a certain respect, nostalgia. Communications, first and foremost. One of the number one reason that a library does not succeed in its conversation with the voters is that they did not actually tell anybody what they were planning to do, or what would happen if it passed, or what would happen if it failed. And you folks I'm not really worried about you with this at all. because you're already engaged in this process in a very open, transparent, and consultative way with folks like me. And most folks are not in your community are not necessarily paying a lot of attention right now. That's okay. They don't need to. 364 days of the year, the board and the staff are there to take care of the library. That's why you're there. You know, for your entire term, that's why you're there until election day, when people pop up their heads and they're like, what's actually happening? The engaged campaign that needs to be run to overcome this no marketing problem is first and foremost an informational communications campaign. It is the responsibility of the board and the staff to tell folks about Plan B and Plan A. Plan A is nice to talk about. It's what happens if it passes. What happens if it passes is great fun to talk about. Talk about that all day long. And there's a certain number of people in the community who can be activated by Plan A. Here's what we plan on doing if it passes. There's a certain kind of person who's a relational supporter of the library who's like, yep, I love this idea. Let's do it. I love using the library. This will be so much better. There's another group of people who are perhaps ideologically aligned with what the library does and who the librarians are. And as the board, you can say, let me tell you about my librarians here. They're ideologically aligned around the outcomes that the library intends to do. Your mission, vision, and values resonates with them, but they're not big users of the library. There's nothing in it for them except for us. We'll have a better town to live in. We'll take care of ourselves and each other a little bit better. Plan A resonates with those people, but Plan B, which is what happens if it fails, is the truth telling that this board needs to be engaged in, the staff needs to be engaged in, because one of two things is going to happen on election day. It's either going to pass or it's going to fail. Plan A gets enacted or Plan B gets enacted. And so you have to do as much work on developing what happens if it fails as you do in developing what happens if it passes. Not to go negative, but to tell the truth to the voters, because they can make a decision then that's informed. And there's a certain group of voters who are out there, a certain group of residents that are out there who, when they hear about Plan B, they're called aversionary supporters. They're like, why are we screwing this up? Let's not screw it up this time. And not the library, you guys are great, but everything else that goes on in your area, in the state of Michigan, in the United States of God help us America. Like, let's not, now that I understand what the implications are, somebody has to define the negative for me as a resident, as a voter. Another component of the marketing plan that we always want to do, and this is not marketing in order to persuade people, this isn't marketing in order to inform. What happens if it passes, what happens if it fails, is to really talk about the people who are doing the work. The institution, you can drive by, see the lights are on, think everything's fine, even in COVID, or you can understand how the staff, if they have the right resources, the right facilities, are part of operationalizing not just the library's mission, vision, and values, but the value system of the community. And the marketing campaign needs to have not just a reference to tomorrow, but a reference to yesterday. And the yesterday part of it, I mentioned a moment ago about if you're going to the ballot in order to extend your success, you need to talk about what your successes were. We did it very well with this kind of capacity then. We'd like to extend that success. Or you need to talk very clearly about what the failures have been that you want to address by going to the ballot. You got to talk about yesterday as much as because it's either your competency as a library community to be successful and that you're worth investing in, or when it's failure, it's your integrity. That you've identified these problems, whatever they may be for you folks, but you've identified some problems and you know how to fix them. And it requires the right kind of investment of taxpayer dollars in terms of the form and the function of the building or the operations or the collections or so the lack of a marketing plan is something that initially you need to overcome, and to align properly around truth telling. Here's what's going to happen if it passes. Here's what's going to happen if it fails. It's up to the voters to decide. We have done our due diligence as the staff and the board and the staff to present you with an affordable, reasonable, well thought out, transparent approach. What do you folks think? Why don't we talk about it on election day? Number two, one of the reasons that libraries fail is because of local opposition. And this again is an area that I'm not necessarily concerned about. I'm trying to flush everything out for you here. But when there's local elected officials who are opposed to it, it's usually because there's some sort of a disconnect between the visible mission of the library and the reason that those people have run for office. Elected officials is the polite term. Politicians is when we don't like them, okay? But why do they run? What do they care about? What's their portfolio? What parts of making a more interesting, thriving, and prosperous place to live are you currently not being connected with them on? And this goes for local elected officials all the way up to Congress. They're your people. You're their constituents. The map between what the library does for a more interesting place to live is fairly clear to me, but we don't necessarily always talk about it inside libraries. Interesting places to live have interesting programs going on, collections that support different parts of the community. It's fun to attend it, either virtually these days or in person. And politicians and elected officials look at interesting places to live because that's what they're invested in. They also look at thriving places to live. And there's health that's part of thriving. There's health information, certainly. There's education in there from early childhood all the way through how you support the schools. But a lot of elected officials, I mean, the school boards are in charge of the schools. The local elected officials might be more involved with like livability as part of thriving or connections coming through COVID. And then the prosperous part is really about how do you support the economic development and the workforce aspects and not just the kids in story time. There's probably 20% of your population that loves the story time work. There's 20% of the population, I would guess, that wants to have a Main Street rebound from COVID. And how can they use the same databases that a kid uses to do research, or the scaled up version of that to have informatics and supply chain analytics and all the stuff that Gale and EBSCO have that you've been paying for in your payables? There's a why question around the opposition that we've seen from local elected officials. Like, why is it relevant to me when the schools are already doing it? Why is it relevant in our community? If the main messaging environment has been around education, you might need to broaden your shoulders. You might need a bigger tent because that's where elected officials or politicians even live. One of the interesting things is that we also like to ask them for their endorsement early in the campaign because they have an opportunity to, well, leverage different groups that they are leaders of. And the bigger tent that we have, the better opportunities we've got to not only communicate more effectively, but to actually partner in two ways. If it passes, you can put a lot to work. You can put it to work a lot faster when there's a lot more awareness and partnerships. And if it fails, you're going to need more support. The third place that there is opposition, and this is not a philosophical difference about government. It's when a philosophical difference about government turns into an active campaign against the library. Organized anti-tax groups in Michigan, in Illinois, where I'm from, in Idaho, in Virginia, you name it, there are times when they want to take it out on the library. And we know very clearly that there's some differences between political language around what a progressive does, what a conservative does, and what a libertarian does. But there's very little difference between a libertarian perspective, a conservative perspective, and a progressive perspective on the work of libraries. But there's occasions where there's a disconnect. And that is important to consider. Not to modify any of the work that you're doing, but perhaps to talk about, well, I mean, on a progressive agenda, you might say that you're helping people connect with government benefits. But on a libertarian agenda, you might want to say that you're lowering barriers to access. And both of them are true. And sometimes we get in our own way with these kinds of situations, and it brings out opposition that is otherwise really looking for places that have low, like it doesn't, it, you folks can put a small amount of money to work, small amount of smart money to work in massive ways, better than any other organization, institution, community anchor institution in any community. And the anti-tax groups need to be engaged, if there are any in the community, early in the process, because they're not necessarily anti-tax. They're anti-dumb tax. They're anti-single purpose tax. They're anti-waste, fraud, and corruption. The truth of how you folks currently govern that library, I mean, I know it from looking at your board docs on the way into this meeting today. It's open, it's transparent, it's consultative. It's small amount of money, very transparently managed, and I would suggest that you have a good opportunity early in your campaign planning to make sure that you are disclosing and inviting, because I'd rather see you passed over from opposition. And maybe somebody philosophically says, you know, I'm not into taxes, but I can get behind this one. That's perhaps one of my biggest goals here. Transparency and early engagement is the thing that really inoculates you against free-floating anti-tax group anxiety. Oh, here on your mission, vision, and values, though, is nothing to compromise on. You are currently either staffing or on the board of a taxpayer-supported institution that requires a progressive tax policy to fund the common good. And if internally to your board, you're having some discussions about that, that's not a bad idea. Because in order to fund the common good, we do have to tax ourselves in different progressive kinds of ways. At least I hope small p progressive kinds of ways. And that philosophy of government is an important place to talk about. If you could run the library all on donations, you would. All right. There's another source of opposition that happens to libraries out there. We've seen this in all kinds of places. And again, this is an opportunity for you to think about the different populations that might want to have a dialogue with each other, who might want to take it out on the library. The watchdog, the community watchdog, sometimes in some places that we've worked in my hometown, I'm going to use different names, but we've got 2 or 3 people who are on social media all the time, who it's like you wake up in the morning, you check Facebook or the Patch or the Nextdoor, and you're like, what did Gary say last night? Like what? And again, his name's not Gary, or what did Susan say last night? And it's not Susan, but you're like, Susan, what are you guys against today? And she's like, what do you got? You know, that I don't want to see the library be in a place where the local watchdogs are focusing on the library, because you, generally speaking, unless there's something going on that I need to hear about from you folks, are not part of that. Like, let's burn it down to fix it kind of mode. There needs to sometimes be, and this is very appropriate to talk about early, though. There's a couple ways to think through this watchdog situation. The most significant is when there is a real crusade going on, and occasionally the library needs a guard dog against the watchdog. There are a lot of folks in communities. So there's a library that we were working with in Connecticut that just had, on the November election, a citywide charter amendment that would have, as a component of many different changes in the charter, would have changed the library from shall have to may have. And in Connecticut, that's the difference between having a budget and not having one. You know, the library shall be funded at a certain amount as opposed to may be funded maybe. And the voters in that community, because there was not just the library, there's several other things going on. There's a lot of different watchdog groups and a lot of different local crusaders who were fighting each other. The numbers are interesting because at the top of the ticket in November, there was a Biden-Trump campaign. They got 100% of the vote from 11,000 people in this little town. And then the charter amendment got only 2/3 of the vote. 1/3 voted against it, and 1/3 plus, a few voted, or minus a few voted for it. It failed, but a full third of the people in that town skipped that vote. They came out for the election. They voted for the president. They skipped something as fundamental as the charter for that town because there was just so much noise. There was just something unseemly about it. And yes, if you had a strong opinion, you voted one way or another. The library was spared mercifully. But a third of the people in that town were like, I'm just going to skip this. And that's the worst part of anything, because if you're not, yeah, I'm not worried about you folks here, but I want to bring it up. And what really supports a better communications campaign is when you can engage the local community, not just from like the usual suspects perspective, but broad based. The library affects in a positive way so many different groups of society. Whenever we're working in a place where there might be contention like this, we always take a look at who could be considered the honorary co-chairs of the campaign. And we've worked in places where the honorary co-chairs have been as diverse as the former head of the high school athletics department, the grande dame of the theater community in town, the former sheriff, in order to sort of disrupt this tribalism and to signal to people that we are, as a library, much bigger and broader than the normal internecine battles that happen. There is always a caveat here. If you are sincerely targeted in this campaign and you're thinking this might be something that needs to be brought to my attention as a pro bono ally and friend of yours, I want to talk it through, because sometimes it gets really, really, really difficult. And it's very, very, very peculiar. I don't want to get into anything more than that because I don't know if you got anything going on. I haven't heard about anything. But it is important for us to look at this honestly, because what a few, this was a real one. This was Winter Park, Florida. I don't even want to get into this. I'm just going to keep going. It's all right. There's another component of why libraries, break down in their communications. This is important, and it is very much about you folks on this call today. There are times when the opposition to the library is not about the library. It's about, sometimes it's personal. Sometimes it is about disconnects that have happened. That sometimes there's I said before about getting out of our own way. And the truth telling about whether or not you personally, as a member of the board, are a good ambassador to a group is part of this. Can you be heard when you take a message about the library and plan A and plan B to a particular audience? Or do we need to find more people who can be advisors to the campaign or proxies for the campaign? And if there is a interpersonal set of issues that might get in the way, it's very important for us to be able to think through how to get you out of that. Not out of the situation, but out of your own way. Also, when we are looking to send people to talk to different groups or populations or stakeholders, different parts of society, I always like to look past a particular kind of title and send the people who are interested in being sent. When we're signing up for a board, we have fiduciary responsibility and policy responsibility, and some of you might not have signed up for a campaign. And I want to acknowledge that at the beginning, because the last thing I want to ever do as a political consultant would be to send a candidate on to meet the press or 60 Minutes without being properly prepped and trained. But also, I don't want to put somebody in a situation where it is uncomfortable and awkward. The getting out of our own ways is sometimes just being honest about, like, saying, this is not for me. I support it. I'm putting my vote in on it. sometimes it's also saying, you know what, I'd love to have this conversation because I'm invested in my hometown. I want to make sure that we're able to take care of these populations. But the negative components of this are, again, whether or not there is we've had situations where the opposition comes out in one town in Ohio. It was terrible. The library director, she's since retired. Her husband was the minority party county commissioner. The two majority county commissioners came out against the library because they were against him, and it became about her. And that's really a shame, you know? So, but again, I'm not really worried about you folks with these things, but I do want to hear where your concerns are as we come through this presentation. I've got 3 more to touch on. I want to hear your questions, comments, concerns. If you're like, this is the craziest thing, Beth, what did you bring this guy in from Chicago for? That's fine too. If none of this resonates with you, then you probably actually don't need to talk to me anymore. But we usually work in places where there's 2 or 3 of these that are either a concern or a real situation. All right. The 6th out of 8 reasons that libraries lose or fail is when there's some sort of a conflict of identity, where the library is a proxy for that identity fight. It's not the watchdog situation. Sometimes you see a situation where the town is growing very quickly, but there's been very little consultation amongst the public by elected officials or developers about where we want to go. So the one thing that you get to vote on is the library, so we're going to take it out on the library. You see situations sometimes where towns are kind of on a slide, and it becomes a fight for limited resources. And the library is not the library is a victim in that kind of a situation because people are taking it out on the one thing that they can control. Again, I'm not sure if I'm worried about you or not here, but we've seen situations where, like, this postcard here is a real postcard that was sent by the California Association of Realtors, their political action committee, against the library measure in Pomona, California in 2014. It's one of my favorite. It's beautifully designed, and they helped ruin the library because that town felt like it had too many taxes and there was too much of a fight. And it was the realtors in their town who were against it, even though the real estate agents should be looking at quality of life, livable community. What we want to be able to do, if there is some sort of a identity issue in the community, is to talk about our identity as a community. The library has a very strong place to stand when it comes to convening conversations about who we are, what our priorities are, who do we want to be. There are essentially 2 main axes of communications around any library measure. Well, 3 these days in COVID. There's 2 pre-COVID, and as we come out of COVID and things get back to some sort of normal. The 2 are compassion and pride. We are either activated for the library based on our shared compassion for a population. I'm not talking about me as a user. I'm talking about me as a stakeholder, a voter, a citizen, that I care about the same people that you folks serve. And activating that compassion and reminding people of their compassion is an important way to break down this old town, new town problem. We are all united in something. And the pride axes of communication might be the way it's done. The pride axes of communication says, well, who do we want to be? What's Auburn Hills like? How are we different than our next door neighbors? What makes us us, and not to make them them, but what makes us us? How do we want to invest in our community? And it's not always about compassion. Sometimes it's about, a more interesting, thriving, and prosperous place to live. The COVID era corollary here, though, is the 3rd thing, which is concern. And in fact, it could be concern, it could be fear. And I don't mean about the immediacy of a health crisis. I mean, where does the library project fit? Where does the library question fit in the solutions to our problems, the ways to ameliorate our concerns? We've had campaigns where the library has failed, one of them in particular where it should have failed, and it did, but we didn't realize that it should have until we were well into the campaign, unfortunately, Oakley, California, small town, about as far away from San Francisco as I'd want to drive if I had a family and had to commute to San Francisco. Okay. Um, it was a new town. It was incorporated in 1999, and they didn't have a library of their own. It was part of like the high school. It was like one room in the high school for the public library, and they wanted to make their own library. Great. And they had a situation where they also didn't have a fire department. And nobody realized that the priorities were slightly off cycle, that we really should have been addressing the priority of the fire department before we addressed the library. But the library people had their act together and they got on the ballot first. So the community truly voted against the library, said to each other, let's vote against the library now. Let's get let's get the fire department done, and we'll come back in 2 years, we'll do the library, and they did it. Now that's not the best way to figure that one out. It's the dialogue about what are our priorities, especially coming through COVID, and how does this particular ballot measure fit that might help break any of these old town, new town identity issues. And of course, there's the question then of who else cares, compassion or pride. All right. The issues are around the race class narrative, though, and the who are we missings here always need to be taken into account, even if you folks feel like you've got a good team already in place. There are always in library campaigns an opportunity to make that bigger tent. And I don't mean just politically or philosophically or alignments around how we tax each other. I don't know who isn't involved in the library right now in your community right this minute, but the campaign is a wonderful way to talk about a shared value system and to bring in folks who might not otherwise have a political voice. The inclusivity of the campaign is a very, very strong opportunity for you to extend your mission, vision, and values, whether it passes or not. And that opportunity to sort of flex the current relationships and get beyond the usual suspects is an important aspect of leadership right now. All right. The seventh reason out of 8 is the most embarrassing, because it sometimes happens because we have not been necessarily either paying attention ourselves as the leadership team, or we're not totally dialed in, or there's actual conflict amongst ourselves. The internal opposition. I mean, marketing is the number one reason. There's a lot of other things in between here and there, but sometimes it's, are we not getting out of our own way, but do we agree with each other? Have we talked about our mission, our vision, and our values, and how going to the ballot for Plan A and what our concerns are that drive us away from Plan B? These sorts of it's almost board effectiveness, folks. Like what are we concerned about? And I applaud you for bringing in somebody like me in, even if you love this or not today, to start thinking about it in that open, transparent, and consultative way, to design projects that are inclusive, to talk about our concerns and our fears, to talk about our political philosophies, to make sure that we've got our legal stuff in line. You're very responsible already. And it does defray and diffuse some of this internal opposition. Internal opposition is not a full stop, though, because if there are moments where we have to dialogue with each other, and this goes for the staff too, like people have got to be comfortable with where this is going, because it's very difficult to go on Meet the Press if you don't actually believe it. I think about Colin Powell when he went in front of the United Nations before the Iraq War, and he knew he was not telling the truth in his own heart. Like that kind of moment is very important to avoid, and it really means that we have to double down on our own comfort. If we have not been paying a great deal of attention, I'd like to suggest that there is a moment where we could all just sort of say, okay, let's take a pause. Let's recap everything that we're supposed to have known already. Let's all get ourselves up to speed. No harm, no foul, folks. Because I want you to be confident with Plan A and Plan B. I want you to be confident with the philosophy of government that underpins a library fundamentally. I want you to be confident with the idea that you're not going to turn into the tax man, that you're still going to be the responsible neighbor. All right, the last thing, so long list. Thank you for sticking with me. Um, this is only for library building projects or very disruptive situations, but I put it in here at the end because it's unique to building projects. Everything else could be for whatever you're looking to ask for. But nostalgia, whether if there's a disruption to the building, if there's a change to the building envelope, we've worked in some places where folks look at the current building, they know it really needs a lot of work. It's fallen down around their ears, and yet that's where they learned how to read, or that's where they learned how to. That's where they taught their grandchild to read. That's where they went and got books on grieving when their own parents died. I mean, there's some real heavy emotional stuff. And there's some of that deep pride as well. Even if the building is fine, what we do in situations where there is some nostalgia around a building is we look to imbue some component of the old building with some emotional weight if it doesn't already have it. Like there's one library that we worked with where they had a bell. The kid, when the kid got the library card, they had to ring the bell. Okay, ship's bell. There's another library we work with that had a bathtub. For some reason or another, 25, 40 years ago, the librarian was like, oh, you got your library card, you get to sit in the bathtub, I want to take your picture. So that's what they did. There's generations of people there who've been ringing bells and sitting in bathtubs. And if you didn't tell people that you're going to take the bathtub across the street to the new building, they thought you were going to throw it in the garbage. And they're going to vote against the library because of that. If it doesn't exist, we have to figure out some way to give them, like one of the things that we did in Winter Park, actually, the old building, nobody wanted it. It was a brutalist eyesore. The new building was, we did glass blocks, and every family for like a year before the election got to put their family name on the glass block, and the kid made some drawings and stuff, and the glass blocks were going to be the new entryway. We carried something forward into the new space and told people we were going to be carrying something forward into the new space. All right. That's a lot of my talking. I hope we're on track for your thoughts. It's important for me to share deeply what we've seen across hundreds of library campaigns. Our win-loss rate's 85%. But it's also 85% in places like Ferguson, Missouri, where we were the first, the library was the first citywide ballot measure after those riots. And it was a situation where we understood from asking good questions and polling the community there in Ferguson, where 78% of people who live in Ferguson loved the library, but only 42% were going to vote for it. And those kinds of disconnects are why I'm taking the time today to take you through deeply what's here. And again, as I said before, if you've got some of these things in play, I want to help you unwind it. I want to help you have a good, honest dialogue with the community about your plan A and your plan B and see where they go with it. I can't ever put my thumb on the scale. You know, I can't make anybody vote a particular way. And your job is not to make anybody vote a particular way. Your job as the board and the staff is to say to people, here's what we've identified as the shortfalls. Here's where we would like to potentially go. What do you think? So let me open that up here for you folks. What are you seeing? And like, none of these might be in play. You might be great, and then we will never have to talk to each other again.
But if John, I do have one question.
Yes, sir.
How do you handle a levy like ours when the last time we had it, it was we passed it somewhere around 70% yes vote.
Mm-hmm. How do I handle? I'm sorry, what?
How do you handle our last levy? We passed it with a 70% yes vote. Mm-hmm. How do you handle that kind of levy?
I'm not sure if I totally understand the question, because everything's changed since the last levy. And when I say everything's changed, there's certain people who are still in town. There's been some turnover. You have voter education to do with folks who are new to the community about. You have to be in touch with how COVID is affecting the current climate as well. I never want to run the last election, whether it was a win or a loss. all I want to reference point on the last election for the library is whether or not you've kept faith with what you told people you're going to do, or you were unable to keep faith with what you told people you're going to do with their money last time around. Otherwise, the next election is the election to focus on.
Okay,
I'm not sure if
thanks.
I'm answering your question though, John. I'm not sure if I'm getting it quite right.
Yeah, you've hit on some of the issues.
Okay.
Thanks.
John, let me take a cut on that in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
This is a library that, this is a community that's very prosperous. They love their library. The last levy passed by a lot. Is not one of the dangers that you didn't specifically mention, we kind of implied complacency, an assumption that, well, it passed last time,
Mhm.
therefore all we need to do is the same thing and everything's going to turn out fine.
Yeah. So Larry Neal up at the Clinton Macomb Library up north or over that way from you guys had a wonderful campaign back in 2014 that was very cognizant of the fact that they haven't had a loss before, but he went out with a theme of promises made, promises kept, in order to remind everybody who hadn't been paying attention for the last several years since the last election, what actually did they use the money for? And it is the responsibility of the board, not just in your annual audit and not just in your annual report, but on election day, for it not to be the first time that people have realized that you are putting a small amount of smart tax money to work on the common value system that they have around either taking care of other people or building a more livable community. The overlay on that also, Bill, for complacency again, is have things been so disrupted by either the health or the economic or both interrelatedly around COVID that our assumptions about how people like us we've been downgraded compared to the things that are really top of mind.
I will say, fortunately for us, the city has done some work in regards to polling the community on their, it's in preparation for a community center that's that is planning to be going to the ballot in the spring, this spring. And so some of that information had been shared with us. And so I think that gives us an idea of some of the things that you brought up as far as attitudes towards taxation, potential for, we're not really seeing any, some of the things we're not seeing, but the potential is there. So I think, that's something that we're working on I think, which one was it? I took screenshots of slides, but it was the one about the guard dogs.
Yeah.
I read before the ballot, and there's a section in there on advocacy. And so we really have started working more deliberately on identifying our advocates in the community, not library users, just people who are passionate about our mission and our vision, and getting them aware of what is happening in the library in regards to our funding situation or loss of funding, and then just making them aware so that they are able to be the spokespeople as well. So
a lot of advocacy trainings that you hear from other library organizations than every library are about loud advocacy work when maybe it's a rally or a petition or whatever. We do our share of those too, locally, state level, and nationally, but the majority of advocacy work is actually very much about education and orientation to your stakeholders. Not like there's no reason to be loud about it. There's a lot of reasons to be open, transparent, consultative, and in dialogue.
Yeah, two groups that were supportive of us in the past and will hopefully be again. One would be the realtors, and the second would be the effective Chamber of Commerce people, the business people, because Arlington is a somewhat insular community, very proud of its success, and we like to portray the library, the schools, the city government as part of that. To make the community what it is,
and that's heartening. My feelings around the timing on having a discussion with those prior supporters and future potential supporters is to go out as early as you can with it, and to say that, we have to go to the ballot or thinking about going to the ballot, the gradations in between of those two things, is to also say, well, what do you think?
Mhm.
And to have it be more of a dialogue than an assumption right now is probably a good idea. I'm going to stop sharing the screen here, if it's
Okay.
okay, and we can get back to the full
Yeah.
deal here with everybody. Or at least I can. So
I think one of the things that'll be different this time is the last two levies were just a continuation.
mhm.
So we could argue no new taxes. This one, we may have to ask for more money.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
I think that argues to get people involved sooner rather than later. And
Mhm.
part of what we found talking to people the last time we did a levy is they assume our tax revenue goes up just like it does for the income tax for the city or for the state, when in fact our revenue that comes from the property tax is flat, is in zero.
Yep.
Virtually zero. So we have to remind people of that.
Yeah, I think that the financial literacy
Mhm.
that is the financial literacy issues start, of course, with the board, and then being able to take them out to the community. There are there's always a number of voters who want to put their bifocals on and give your numbers a strong look. Okay, and that strong look is your job as the board to provide. They are not interested necessarily initially in stories about the impacts. They want to see the numbers. They deserve the numbers. They use the numbers as a gateway, much like a sports fan does. The box scores are your gateway to the stories about the team. The team's on a streak, the team's on a slump, the star player's doing whatever, the management's doing X or Y to optimize or correct. But the numbers are the gateway to that, and you owe them the numbers. There's also a little bit of financial literacy training. I mean, everybody in Michigan's heard of Headley, but nobody knows what it means. Those kinds of things.
I think one of the things that I'll be working with the board on is that I think we have I can tell you all the plan A and what we would do,
Mhm.
but the plan B I think is a much tougher discussion to have.
Yeah, it's not a fun discussion, but one of two things is going to happen on election day. Either there's going to be the funding stream to enact Plan A, or there won't be.
Right.
And responsible management is anticipating that. We worked with Crystal Lake, Illinois, it's Crystal Lake Public Library, where they had an accidental Plan B back in like 2008 that they ended up euphemistically calling Project Shoehorn. They had to shoehorn what they wanted to do with the library in the wrong size building. Okay, they failed to pass the measure. They had Project Shoehorn. Okay, like that. Nobody wanted to see Project Shoehorn happen, but nobody understood that Project Shoehorn needed to happen until after the fact. And the voters and the community members were like, "Why are we shoehorning this thing together? Why is it spit and tape right now? Why is it Band-Aids? We should have a better situation." It's not manipulative in any way, shape, or form to tell people the truth of what it's going to be like for their library,
Right.
as an expression of the mission, vision, and value system of the community. And there are communities that we've worked with who have said no to the library after hearing about Plan B. It is their absolute right to do it. Douglas County, Oregon, closed their entire library system on a vote of the electors in 2016 because they had Plan A, which is to make an independent library district with its own taxing authority, and Plan B was to close 9 buildings in 11 towns across the county, and they chose to do that with like a 56% vote against the new district. It was open, it was transparent, it was consultative. I don't like it. I don't like it one bit because I'm a library guy.
Right.
But I can't fault them for making an informed decision about the future of their community. All right, there's some people who haven't said anything.
Gloria?
Yeah, what's on your minds? We've got a few more minutes. We started a little late, so I want to keep going if we could. I'm sorry?
Lots of information. I'm just kind of processing a lot of it still.
Mhm.
I think, which I very much appreciate. And, you know, I mean, I sort of will piggyback on both John and Bill. I mean, the library is loved in the community. We've had, you know, successful levies, but I totally get that this will be different. And, you know, everybody's sort of, you know, it's that whole tax to death kind of thing. Though, you know, this community has always supported education
Mhm.
and the library, particularly. But and I think in view of COVID, you know, people are thinking differently. So you certainly have to think this is not necessarily going to be the same kind of levy, I think. But I love the idea of transparency and getting out ahead of all these things early, you know, sharing our message. And I certainly agree that you always have to, you know, have your plan A, which we certainly want to happen, but you also have to be very honest with people and say, this is going to happen if we don't pass this.
Mhm.
And as careful as we have been, we know we have a limited amount of resources. So, you know, you know, you've just really hit the nail on the head, I think, in many, many ways. And I think it's just discussions that the board's going to have,
Mhm.
you know, to talk about how we want to do this and what kind of leadership we need in the community. I mean, Beth has done a great job. She's already out talking to people, which
Mhm.
is great.
Mhm.
And she's worked really closely with the city and the schools because we do, you know, we sort of pride ourselves in this community that we work together.
Mhm.
Those entities at the very least, and other groups like the chamber and the realtors, you know, the various larger groups like Leadership UA, which, you know, trains, many of us have done that program and, you know, come away knowing much more about how the whole city works, city schools, libraries, what have you. So, you know, I certainly think we have to reach out, the sooner the better, you know, to all those people and have them on board with us, understanding and, you know, ready to go with us.
You hit the nail on the head, Gloria, with it. The phrase that I would suggest as you're considering where to position your time and effort for communications, the phrase that I would suggest that you want to come back to again and again is, or sorry, not the phrase, the question that you want to come back to again and again is a short phrase. It's who else cares? Okay. Who else cares like we do about a population? Who else cares like we do about this place we both call home? Who else cares about a particular aspect of community life? Who else cares about, or the other one is who else should care? You know, sometimes it's like, who else should care about the fact that we're doing something here with a small amount of smart tax money to help a particular population or build a pride of place or fix COVID problems, you know? That speculation leads to a good Rolodex. And then to decide from there who should be the one from the library to go be the emissary, that's personal aptitude, that's, you know, training, that's a willingness to go have that kind of dialogue. But you can come back around to, well, if we want to do this in plan A, who else would care about that? And if we're concerned about plan B, leaving somebody behind, who else cares that we'd be leaving that person behind or that group behind? So it might be a nice trope for you as you're looking to, you know, where do we start? That list of who else does care, who else should care. And no offense to the education mandate, as I said earlier, there's probably a percentage, there's definitely a percentage of I know that we're streaming right now to YouTube. I'm going to say this out loud. I'm not the biggest person about kids, me personally. Like, I think they're charming. I got 2 of them, they're great. They got a couple good friends. The rest of them, whatever. I'm not a kid person. You can tell me kid stories all day long. I'm like, what's the built environment, the infrastructure? Like, tell me about your zoning, situation there. I'll tell you what your value system is, like, I am not going to get, my heart's not going to get any more activated for kids. My heart's going to be like, what are we doing about workforce? What are we doing about helping somebody find their first, best, or next job? What are we going to do about that empty storefront over there? Like, to me, somebody else is going to take care of the kids. Somebody who actually would love to do story time. I don't want to do story time personally. I want somebody else to do story time for me, So I understand what you're saying about education, but the COVID slide on education, you're not going to be able to stand on that gap completely. And education and grade level shortfalls or grade level reading in Michigan, I know that's a very important element of things, but what are we doing about the fact that we've had our businesses closed and folks not working, I got to say, for relevancy's sake, you're going to need to not only have a bigger tent of who else cares, but maybe some new messaging that takes you, that takes you beyond some of those core library competencies.
Well, I agree. And I think I loved that you hit on the workforce issue, because I think many people do come to the library for that kind of help. We have a large senior community here. And I think, and we do a lot of things for them, but, we shouldn't forget about them either, but certainly the business community. With you.
And then again, I could just eat crow here, because I just flashed over to Kent District Library over in Wyoming County outside of Grand Rapids. Kent District Library is pretty big, and we did some polling for them back in their campaign in 2015, and we discovered that the number one thing that people appreciated from the Kent District Library was their services for the blind and visually impaired, and everybody on the board went, "What services for the blind and visually impaired?" Not in a bad way. There's only 75 people that took advantage of it in the entire community, but the heart there of the voters was like, "Oh, we got to invest in our," and they did after they passed it. So maybe I'm totally wrong about this education thing with you folks.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, we're approaching our time together, I believe.
Yes.
With a little bit of a late start, I appreciate you staying with me on this. Any other thoughts? Big red flags? Any these guys crazies? Oh, you can talk about that with each other later. So I'm here to help you as a leadership team think things through. I'm also here to help if you are reflecting upon this list of reasons that libraries, fail to communicate effectively, and you need to have some help unwinding ideas. I don't have a toolkit for you. It's always about the place that you live in. It's not my hometown. It's your hometown, if I can be of help, I'd be very happy to. And I do applaud you for starting this thought process and this approach as early as you are. I don't know if you all know the story about how Beth and I met, but she came to our conference back in September. One of a few people, 1,000 people in this country who wanted to really lean in on this political conversation, this focus on funding. And so I want to show up for her too in any way I can.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much, John. Really and truly, I made lots of notes, and they're just, you hit on a lot of things that, I think are absolutely relevant, and
Great.
that, we really do need to think about and talk about as a board.
I'll be sending Beth the slide deck, for distribution as a prompt for you. There's not a lot of slides in it, but and my contact information is in there too. So.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for your time. It's very, very much appreciated.
Yes, thank you.
Thank
Anything
you,
else
John.
we need to do, Beth?
I think just adjourn the special meeting, correct?
If there's no, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
I did.
Any other discussion, questions, anything? If not, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?